Thank you all so much. It's really lovely to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to keep my clock out so that I don't go over time. This is a subject about which I could just go on and on and on, and so I promise you that I won't. So I'll talk a little bit about the format and the origins of today's talk and then just jump right in. But before I do, I want to say a huge thank you to Paige, to Kristen, the public programs team, to my colleague Dan, who is our AV specialist, to Martina, who's my wonderful cubicle mate in our curatorial department, but also a good friend who is the convener of this series, and to fellow speakers, one of whom will be Martina Jackson's talk last week, which was fantastic, and then Lynn. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes today. I also know there's a wealth of experience in the room, and so I'm really excited to get to Q&A, and I will have questions maybe for some of you as well. I'm going to talk about a Boston-based collective, Boston University's program in Artisanry, which existed in its original state just down the road from here on Comm Ave between 1975 and 1985. And it's a program about which I have become deeply passionate over the last couple of years. And I call it a craft supernova. It's very intertwined with the MFA's history of exhibition making and collecting, and it's touched many generations now of students in craft and beyond across this country and many others. I'm going to try and pitch the talk today so that it grapples with the tensions that were inherent in this program between breaking aesthetic, conceptual, and disciplinary boundaries, and then simultaneously trying to find a more inclusive and diverse landscape for contemporary craft, a field often historically dominated by white culture in institutions, even as it flourishes across intersections outside museums and schools. So the overarching thrust of my talk today positions contemporary craft as a very unapologetic part of the contemporary creative landscape. And it also pokes and prods, though, at some of the assumptions that craft makes about itself. Back in the 80s and the 70s, as well as now, craft often thinks of itself as being an inherently open, accessible, and welcoming field. And while we will meet some of the students and faculty from PIA who broke barriers and boundaries in the field because of their personal identities and experiences, looking at this particular program and at craft education as a whole, particularly in the United States, helps us see clearly who gets to participate in these spaces of art and craft education, especially in a country where access to knowledge and learning is never guaranteed. It's often prohibitively expensive, and it deserves to be much more democratized than it is. Once I've introduced PIA and told you about its formation and the reasons that I think it's such an important contribution to the history of the creative landscape in Boston, I'm going to widen the lens to talk a little bit about the context of how I came to look at this program and why looking at craft education is, I think, a worthwhile place to concentrate a body of research. And then I'd be very happy to take any questions. So I shall begin. I'll begin with this slide. Boston University's program in Artisanry, or PIA, formed rapidly in 1974, and then due to the vagaries of financing and leadership that plagues so many craft schools, it combusted with equal swiftness 10 years later in 1985. It eventually found a new home, first at the Swain School of Design, and then in New Bedford at the University of Massachusetts, where it continues to produce stellar graduates today. And I visited the program a few years ago for the first time in South Dartmouth in Massachusetts in its current incarnation, which is a pretty easy drive from where I live in Providence. Yeah, to tell you how important this program was to American craft, I have to outline just what a wild child of a program it was at its inception back in 1975, or really actually 1974. It crystallized the ambitions of the studio craft movement like no other person, program, or phenomenon before it, and it is, in my opinion, as important to the field of craft history and wider art histories as sites like Black Mountain College or Haystack Mountain School of Craft. A craft supernova, PIA is the craft school that you may never have heard of, although I say that with some reservation actually in this room, you probably have, but places that I go to often haven't, but that you need to know. And I should say before I begin, it's important, I owe great thanks to many other researchers along the way. The first person I want to thank is Ned Cook. Back in the spring of 2021, when I wondered whether I'd actually ever get to work inside of a museum again, I got to have a chance conversation with the person who first introduced me to PIA, which was Ned. He had held basically the same job before me, as I now do at the MFA, but 40 years before I was here. He finished up his PhD at Boston University and then embarked on a curatorial and academic career just around the time I was born, actually. And I asked Ned if I could interview him about how he came to learn about craft and build the MFA's collection when I was stuck working from home during the depths of the first year of the pandemic. And so he generously agreed. He's been an incredibly kind source of craft knowledge to me ever since. And some of his very first words out of his mouth when we spoke were, well, how much do you know about Boston University's program in Artisanry? And my answer back then was nothing at all. But 4 years later, that has drastically changed thanks to him. So much so that it's hard to actually squitch such a rich history into an abbreviated form here. So let me set out, though, the context for craft education in the United States just before PIA came onto the scene. Post-war craft was rooted in concerns about design reform, manual industry, philanthropic economic development, as well as an obsession with regional vernacular, bless you. And it was dominated by the influence of a few well-known craft teachers. The entry of PIA onto the scene shifted things dramatically. Not everyone was happy about these changes, and some still aren't. As you see here, faculty member at PIA, Alphonse Mathieu, he drew a cartoon for the cover of a 1984 exhibition catalogue, and I absolutely love it. His illustration depicts this contretemps between an 18th century Chippendale highboy chest with its arms crossed really haughtily and a jaunty postmodern chair beside it that has an anthropomorphized head, a punk hairstyle, and cross rails carved like lightning bolts. Its legs are confidently spread, and that was meant to demonstrate this tension in the program, but because of the program, in the larger craft field between quote-unquote traditional and contemporary approaches to material, in this case wood. Alphonse was a teacher in the wood studio. And it really was something that played out in this hothouse microcosm at Boston University. Encouraged to make the program was John Silva, the controversial president of the university, and he was encouraged by, at the time, a university trustee, a lawyer turned developer, Paul Helmuth, with whom actually it's a complex story that I get into more in the longer chapter on this, but he had some real estate development connections with Paul Helmuth. But Helmuth was a university trustee at the time, and they both recognized that craft courses represented a significant new strand of funding from both federal and philanthropic sources who were eager to underwrite quote-unquote hands-on vocational training. And so Silba's institution of the program in Artisanry coincided with the close of the Vietnam War, which produced a new crop of GI Bill-funded students, among others, as well as the rise in popularity of vocational technical course offerings that equipped students with a university education and a concrete, applied professional outcome. And it's important, I'll come back to that in a second. PIA was very much about this mixture of entrepreneurship and business alongside this notion of contemporary craft as an aesthetic, artistic pursuit. Helmuth, importantly, and this is why I have the image here, was also a trustee of the Franklin Foundation here in Boston, whose financial backing was key to PIA's catalyzation. In a 1976 interview, John Silba, the president of BU, intimated that the program in Artisanry was Helmuth's idea, and it was, and I quote Silba, gotten off the ground at the speed of light to give Helmuth a special reason to be interested in Boston University when other universities were bidding for his assistance. End quote. So the building chosen to house PIA was located at 616, 620 Com Ave. It was a former car dealership, as so many of those buildings along Com Ave were once, and it was already owned by BU, so it was somewhere that they could move into immediately. Between December 1974 and September 1976, so when the program was already underway, over 40,000 square feet of space at the site was renovated to provide new studios and associated administrative spaces. Outreach for prospective students was made to high school art departments and guidance counselors. Craft Horizons printed an article on the nascent program in its April 1975 edition, so it was just a couple months after the program had begun. And it commended, and I'm quoting Craft Horizons here, a prestigious university making a serious commitment to the proposition that being an artisan is not only desirable for the values and satisfactions of the work itself, but is also a possible way of making a living, end quote. And so that was the really, or one of the really interesting and important things about PIA. Students were taught business classes alongside their studio practice to encourage sustainable artistic careers post-graduation. Although when I spoke to about 30 or so of the former PIA students, the classes they recall above all others were actually those in visual culture and history that were taught by the historian and curator John T. Kirk, who actually happened to be the partner of the then contemporary curator in the department that I'm now in, Trevor Fairbrother. They now live up in Maine. But apparently Kirk's lectures were completely legendary, and students and faculty remember them very, very dearly. The PIA's conceptions of making, mastery, and craft pedagogy immediately and indelibly, in my eyes at least, set a new benchmark for what was expected of university training in craft, especially through its unique non-degree granting certificate in mastery track that welcomed promising makers regardless of their qualifications and molded them from apprentice to journeyman to master. And what you're seeing here in the picture is a copy of Trent Whittington's certificate in mastery. He wasn't the first to graduate in that program, but you can see all of the different professors who were part of his committee signing off as he graduated. And so if you took the COM program, the Certificate of Mastery, you had a final master work that was judged by a panel of well-known artists and makers in the field. People were called in to come in and be part of this committee. So it's the students that were part of it often said it was quite nerve-wracking. It wasn't just your faculty, it was people who were coming in who you might have seen in a Shelter magazine, who might be some of your heroes. And the admission to the certificate was intended to be, a bit contrarily, both highly selective and radically open, which was another interesting part of it. It was dependent solely upon a portfolio evaluation, but it required no other prior formal qualifications, for example, the high school diploma or standardized tests usually needed for university admission. The Certificate of Mastery students were particularly important also as aspirational examples to the 2- and 4-year degree participants who made up the rest of the student body at PIA. They were seeing these Certificate of Mastery students as the things to aspire to, or the people to aspire to. So the Certificate of Mastery was, I think, one of these incredible contributions, yes, to the sort of field here in Boston, but really to the wider field, the wider craft field at this point in time. My argument is that it was introduced at a critical moment for the craft landscape in the United States. It was designed as a practical way to encourage student admission from previously untapped applicant pools, and there was sort of a canny, very, thoughtful intention behind that in terms of just bringing in student numbers. But it also quickly became a way to anoint individual artists, and in doing so to expand and reframe the contemporary craft canon. The certificate was conferred based upon this juried assessment of mastery or excellence, which was viewed as a synthesis of deep knowledge of technique and then also individual artistic motivation. It was also a means to differentiate the offerings of PIA from other art schools, and that moment in time where there was at least an accusation, if not a reality, of the loss of material-specific knowledge as students at art schools and other institutions embrace what one art historian has termed, quote, the great modernist inheritance of de-skilling, end quote. So, in this sense, PIA succeeded for a brief period as the apotheosis of the studio craft movement's ambition to enshrine craft as a fine art and makers as these autonomous, collectible, and conceptual artists. It was an ideal that would be challenged by the vagaries of the market, as well as encroaching costs of tuition, which went up pretty steeply during the 10 years of PIA's existence at BU. But it was a brief reality that shaped influential museum exhibitions, collections, and craft scholarship. The students and faculty that PIA nurtured produced several generations of studio craft artists who came to dominate craft discourse, collecting, and aesthetics in the ensuing decades, and they still do, and rightly so. And so striving for this mastery of skill, its imaginative application, and entrepreneurial success were the core tenets of this really special program, the Certificate of Mastery. However, while the faculty skewed male, there was significant representation of female students among these Certificate of Mastery recipients across disciplines. Ellen Schoen was the first ever COM graduate across any media. She's here in Boston, a phenomenal bass Boston ceramicist. In the undergraduate wood studio, so not COM students, but 2 and 4 year degree students, Wendy Maruyama and Alice Turkle challenged the traditionally male-dominated scene. And I'm super excited. I will get finally to chat to Alice soon, I hope, about her work. She has worked for a long time now as an educator in Boston. She shares a woodshop space with, among others, her husband, Mitch Warrison, the phenomenal woodworker Alison Crony-Moses. They're all in a great space in Alston. But Turkle was deeply influenced by the folk art that she was introduced to in Kirk's class and through a related visit to the Winterthur Museum. And she began to create chests with colorful painted narrative scenes that borrowed from American folk motifs and imagery. These were initially dismissed by teachers and fellow classmates. There had been sort of a purity of the wood grain for the first couple of years in PIA's classrooms. And this notion of bringing paint in was somewhat sacrilegious. And I've asked Alice, do you have pictures of these? And she's like, I don't really have any of the physical objects anymore. I am desperate to see them because I think for me, they're the sort of a ground zero in a way of the experimentation that many other artists, including Tommy Simpson and Wendy Maruyama, amongst others, took on at that point in time with paint on wood. So it was significantly controversial for material purists of an earlier generation, but an important contribution and one by a woman working in wood, much like the work and the importance of the presence of somebody like Wendy Maruyama too. Yet, and I will note, and this is somewhere or something that I have thought a lot about in the dissertation chapter, in the longer chapter that I've written on PIA, gender parity in faculty and student bodies here and in wider experiences across craft programs and art schools in the US at this time remain deeply skewed, especially dependent on material. So even as 75% of students at US art schools in the 1970s were female, 98% of their instructors were male. And in an interview, one of the PIA graduates, who I will remain nameless for now, recalled that in the ceramics studio, Bill Sachs was friends with the ceramicist Karen Carnes, who had been at, among other places, Black Mountain College. And Karen became a mentor to this female ceramicist. And Karen advised her to have, quote, only one child, advice that gained resonance when the owner of a still extant Boston gallery told not Karen, but this other ceramicist, that he did not carry women or those with teaching commitments as art has to be your whole life. So the landscape was, even as this was a supernova of a program and really changed things in so many ways, it also was still part of its historical moment in time where things remained same, and not different at all. So many PIA graduates went on to embrace white cube gallery exhibitions, saw their work join museum collections, including ours. They became leading university teachers and independent artists. They sent out reverberations that still ripple through the craft landscape today, not least to the collection that I shepherd here, which is home to many PIA-connected works. The program's decade at BU ushered in a cross-pollination of thought and output that embraced historical forms, not as icons to be meticulously copied, but as a font for aesthetic sampling and self-discovery. And let me say that again, that's a very, very important part of PIA, self-discovery, which was the purview at that point in time of art schools. It wasn't necessarily always something, at least at that historical moment, that was as encouraged within a university craft program. It was getting there, but it was, I think PIA's contribution was very important in that regard. Something that wasn't, that notion of self-discovery, not always traditionally embraced by craft education. And I've put here actually two really phenomenal works that we have in the MFA's collection from PIA faculty member Alphonse Mattia on the right-hand side, and then Wendy Maruyama's work made just before actually she came to PIA, but we just acquired this work in the last couple of months. So the program's unique pedagogical ethos created this idealistic craft school in an urban liberal arts university, a place of making that felt akin to an art school but eschewed the de-skilling occurring at such sites. These students were required to develop not only technical mastery, of which many were actually in nascent possession when they came to the program, but also a conceptual approach all of their own. With an imagination freed by abundant skill, they could create conceptual personal works in ways that challenged commonly held stereotypes about the relationship of craft to tradition, regional style, and community. Within this hybrid environment, PIA's administrators and faculty placed particular emphasis on welcoming students who didn't enter the program with established academic credentials. And in many cases, as I said, these students simply presented portfolios of work undertaken in apprenticeships or through self-directed learning. This shift was achieved through an all-star teaching cast that BU's controversial but interesting president, John Silber, claimed correctly was, and I quote him, one of the finest craft faculties yet assembled at one institution. And actually, before I move on from this slide, I note here, so Thomas Hucker, one of the really interesting students that I was lucky enough to interview as part of the research for this particular part of the book and dissertation, was really interested again in this notion of skill. And many of the students that I spoke to and many of the faculty felt very strongly that this idea of being incredibly skilled within your particular material was not antithetical actually to having an imagination, having an ability to think as a quote unquote conceptual artist might do. And in fact, having that foundational knowledge allowed their minds and their ideas to go much further. And for me, again, that was a really interesting connection between these two things that are usually, or have at least at this juncture within craft and art pedagogies, been somewhat separated. So Hucker speaks to that in his quote on the slide. So the shift was, as I said, brought about through this all-star teaching cast. And literally, Silber and his colleagues at BU went through Studio Potter, or they wouldn't have gone through fine woodworking because it wasn't quite there yet. It was founded a couple years after PIA, but they went through these important shelter magazines and looked through the stars of craft for that moment in time, and then didn't take them or invite them because they had stellar teaching credentials. They were people who were name recognition folks in their field. And they included Alphonse Mathieu, Jerry Osgood, James Krenov, but only for a semester because he was kind of ornery, and so he got removed and went to create his own wonderful school at Fort Bragg on the California coast. Dorian Zakai, Barbara Shawcroft, Chris Guston, Bill Sachs, and Rick Hirsch, just to name but a few. And I've actually noted here the folks in bold, we don't yet have them in our collection. I really wish we did, and this is something that I'm working on. So if you have leads, please let me know. But it's very important to us to represent these folks here within the MFA's collection. Tommy Simpson popped in to give workshops and then taught for a year. He was a woodworker who worked in sort of fantastical, wonderful, painted, imaginative shapes. Tom Losa, Wendy Maruyama, Liz Alpert, all students of PIA, amongst many others, graduated, and they went on to show at the Helen Drutt Gallery, Peter Joseph Gallery, Workshop. They were the galleries of this moment in time in New York and Philadelphia and beyond. So during its decade in operation in Boston, the program in Artisanry was really at the vanguard of framing the contemporary maker as an independent artist with a market for their work outside of the craft fair circuit. PIA insisted that its graduates could expect to earn a living making their own work, whatever they decided that might be, from production pottery to indeed actually kitchen cabinets to one-of-a-kind pieces in furniture. Existing within a university, but as a discrete endeavor solely devoted to craft, and sharing the resources and status of its parent institution at BU, but with a deliberately open policy that often pushed against these traditional entry qualifications for applicants, the program in Artisanry produced an unusual and very dichotomous environment in which to learn. And its effect was contrary. It in some ways decreased the hermetic inclinations and the dominance of institutions like the American Craft Council, which had really sort of, if not had a chokehold on, been incredibly important to the formation of contemporary craft networks in the post-war period. And it and other organizations like it, often founded by a similar set of people, if not the same person, Alien Osborne Webb, had sought to form, organize, and instrumentalize a very legible field of contemporary craft. And so PIA pushed against that somewhat as it deepened and complicated the status of craft in relation to other forms of contemporary art production and discourse. So while part of PIA's success was its ability to connect contemporary craft to this wider network of audiences and associations, it was also unashamed in its academization, of craft, which had a somewhat narrowing effect in a sense too. It separated craft, at least in its studios, from hobbyists or extra academic makers, which was not the case for seasonal craft schools, which had a much more open policy in many ways. And so it really was creating, if not just an elite echelon who felt destined to occupy museum and gallery spaces, that was one of the primary focuses of this particular program. So thanks to the many curators at the MFA who came before me, but perhaps particularly to Ned Cook and Jonathan Fairbanks, who were right here in the 70s and 80s, meeting artists, attending classes at PIA. In fact, Ned went there as he was finishing his PhD to figure out how you make a dovetail, what some of the work might look like, making it now that he was writing about in terms of 18th century furniture. Some of that work that emerged from the sort of explosive decade of BU's PIA program has been collected at the museum. And you see here the catalog for Ned's wonderful New American Furniture exhibition that happened here in 1989. Over 50% of the exhibiting artists were PIA students and faculty. And the premise of the exhibition was an invitation to artists to plumb the depths of the museum's historic American furniture collection and riff on it. And they absolutely did not disappoint. In fact, the Tom Hucker work that I showed you a couple of slides previously was one of those works that came out of this exhibition. It was, however, though, a project that almost didn't happen because the museum's exhibition committee wasn't confident that artists working in furniture could be trusted to make commissioned work that would rise to the occasion. And Ned said when I spoke to him, basically the response was when he took this proposal, to the exhibition committee back in, I think, 1986 or so, he was asked, how will we know that they will produce something good enough for museum display? It was their main concern. And so it was an anxiety that existed around the decorative arts in general. And I think here, again, this is where PIA really made a contribution to Boston and certainly beyond it as well. We are a museum, and there are many museums like us where fine art, painting, sculpture, even now photography, reigned. And I love the kind of pushback that Ned's show gave in particular. And it came in part from, you couldn't ask for a better critic, actually, to come and see the exhibition and then to rebuff some of these anxieties of the museum and the fine art field. Renowned critic and cultural figure Arthur Danto pointed to the historical myopia of these hierarchies when he positively reviewed Ned's exhibition for The Nation in 1990. In framing his praise for an exhibition that was, and I quote Danto, alive to the referential powers of furniture as the bearer of meaning, and radiant with a collective intelligence, wit, knowledge, expressiveness, skill, and beauty. Danto traced the history of denigrating the decorative arts in modern art history back to Sandro Botticelli's late 15th century painting, panel painting Primavera, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. It was originally part of an elaborate settle, or settee, or in Italian a lettuccio, in the bedchamber alcove of a Florentine patron. And Danto notes that art historians have venerated the painting without acknowledging it as a component of a larger piece of furniture. The latter element has been consigned to anonymity, and I'm quoting Danto again, as if the boundary between the bottom edge of Primavera and the upper edge of Lettuccio's cornice was a metaphysical boundary that divides spirit from crass body, as if, indeed, Lettuccio and painting together compose a kind of monster like the centaur, half beast and half human, end quote. So Cook's exhibition, this one, and others, and the artists within it, 14 out of a total of 25 of whom were PIA graduates, had finally challenged the idea that furniture didn't belong in the world of fine art. The program in Artisanry was a bold riposte to the anxieties and judgments of an art museum and the art world at large that worked within rigid hierarchies of genre, value, and medium. And so for this reason and so many more, PIA for me represents a benchmark in the institutionalization of craft education, which in turn was a particularly crucial turning point for the movement known as studio craft. Though short-lived in its original incarnation at BU, surviving for only a decade before being axed because it failed to generate the financial dividends of other science and liberal arts course curricula, the PIA, and specifically I think the Certificate of Mastery, marked this watershed moment when contemporary craft claimed its own space within academic and museum communities and developed audiences and markets for a category of the visual arts that had been long overlooked and underestimated. So that's where I want to turn a little. I'm doing good in terms of time, that's great, but I will keep moving on. I want to share a little bit about the context of how I came to look at PIA. And I'll see how many of these slides I can get through. I'm going to be careful that I don't go over the 45, 50-minute mark. But I want to turn to the larger question of why look at craft education. And sorry, I should say here, this was one of the banners that was put on the outside of the PIA program. There was great protest, mostly because it came as a surprise to a lot of the students. They were signed up for their spring classes in 1975 and then told with very little warning that they would not be carrying on there, much like has actually happened more recently at the University of Massachusetts program in Artisanry in its current incarnation, which is deeply, deeply worrying. It's an important program to keep alive wherever it's going to be. But yes, I want to look at the wider question of why craft education. Why does craft education provide a compelling arena of study, and what does it tell us about contemporary creative practices? So for a moment, and it's maybe easier to do now on a Thursday afternoon, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to think of a time that you loved learning how to do something really well with your hands, whether that's working a wooden lathe, cooking food rich with meaning or taste, tending to the needs of another human, or something else that might fall under the banner of an expansive understanding of craft. And when you recall that moment, do you remember how you came to know just what to do and just how and when to do it? The project that I've been chasing for the past 4 years at the MFA began with this very inquiry, and the heart of which is now a question that I've asked hundreds of times across the country. Who is the teacher that brought you to your craft practice? Over 3 years, I aged a decade, as you can tell from these photographs, and I traveled by Amtrak train and occasionally by car and bus and on foot across all 48 states of the all 48 continental United States, and also via Zoom to Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam, to ask this question of people who practice many different forms of making objects, communities, and ideas. Many of us have been lucky enough to learn from someone who may or may not call themselves an educator, but who has, in ways large or small, changed the trajectory not only of our learning, but of our lives. I became attentive to how this works within craft education in the United States for several reasons that I explained throughout the pages of the associated book, which will be published this time next year, and these are some of the mock-ups for it just here. But at its root, my interest springs from two assertions. The first is that we have all practiced craft in some form at some stage in our lives. Knowingly or not, we've all been touched, and I would argue often formatively shaped by craft in a sense. And I have these images here. They're from my own family archives. I really love, amongst other definitions, when you're a craft curator, you often get asked, how do you define craft? And I have a library of places to point people because there's no one perfect definition. But Richard Sennett, in his book, 2008 book called The Craftsman, is a particularly nice place to share with people because he thinks about it in this sort of very porous and fluid way. It's not necessarily just a material-specific knowledge. It's not always tied to tradition, although it can be to those two things. It can be parenting. It can be community organizing, it can be computing even, or creating code. So many of us first participate in craft through these types of ways. A grandparent might teach us a family recipe, or we watch a friend make something and we want to join in, or a neighbor introduces us to a particular tool or material at their kitchen table. We might later find ourselves in one of the myriad sites of more formalized craft education in this country, from glass hot shops in urban centers and bucolic retreats that cater to weavers and potters, to local community efforts to create classes that celebrate culturally specific knowledge and resources. Or we might find ourselves simply sitting at home with a family member of a different generation who tells us with care and intention, this was your great aunt's way of doing it, or that's the way my brother taught me how to do it. And whatever the it is, it's my argument that these moments linger as very embodied memories in a way that's almost epigenetic in its effect. The second is that while education is important for things like the pleasure of knowledge transfer or the preservation of ways of doing things, participation in educational spaces and structures is also a political act that remakes our world and has the potential to open up new ones. And I feel these truths very personally, and when I take them on in my research, when I think about craft education, they are absolutely not abstract to me. I'm the first in my family to complete a high school experience and then go on to college. I'm a citizen of a country, Scotland, where education is free for everyone, always. And I'm also a graduate of a doctoral program, almost a graduate, of a doctoral program at the University of New York that has an institutional mission, which is to teach the children of a whole people. This connects to a wider philosophy, a political philosophy of accessible and intersectional education, to which I subscribe, and I know many of you do too, which is summed up by the work of the late great scholar, pedagogue, and activist Bell Hooks, as she reminds us, quote, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement which makes education the practice of freedom," end quote. So contrary to this powerfully open ideal, and in direct contrast to my homeland, Scotland, where education is free, learning environments can feel inaccessible and very expensive here in the US. Yet, craft often bucks this axiom. And while I have visited many highly institutionalized spaces of craft teaching and learning that charge tuition, it is just as common, and in fact sometimes more so, that while treasured and respected, craft knowledge is often offered in free or low-cost ways. So there's then a related issue that I came across as I was researching, which is how to properly value craft knowledge and labor and sustain it in the places that it exists. And this was a recurring conversation that is then threaded throughout the chapters of my book. So my central research question took me, my sleeping bag, and you see me even older here. Sometimes I did not wash for several days, and so that is what the appearance is in some of these photographs. But I took a sleeping bag and my notebook to craft schools of all shapes and sizes, as well as libraries, universities, community centers, homes, studios, and the great outdoors. I chose Amtrak as my primary method of transport as it was the most environmentally friendly. It felt safe for a solo female traveler. I got to travel in the landscape rather than fly over it. And it allowed me to keep up with work back at the museum rather than have my hands on the wheel. And so over countless hours and many cups of tea, I listened to people tell me about their formative teachers through the lens of their differing craft practices. I met a high school teacher in Lapwai in Idaho who's taught indigenous beading and weaving to teenagers for over 40 years and who learned from a peer because her own mother had been forced to attend an assimilative boarding school and couldn't teach her. I met a tattoo artist in Oregon who learned from friends. I met a midwife in Florida and brew makers in Arkansas, Minnesota, and Kentucky who were each putting their own stamps on craft traditions, proudly handed down over decades, and many more people and places that readers, I hope, will meet too in the pages of the eventual book. And at Berea, Aaron now texts me every couple of weeks with what the students have been making. So these are relationships and connections that have, for the most part, been sustained after these meetings as well. All of the people that I met answered my questions about their teachers, often at length, with great care, and really, truly in ways that sometimes brought a lump to my throat and to theirs as they remembered formative educational moments, both good and I will say bad as well. Sometimes there were very conflicting stories. In some cases, their influential craft teachers were well known, and in a few cases, their work was held in museum collections, including here at the MFA. But most of the time, the teachers that opened the door to their creative lives were the same as so many of yours and mine: parents, grandparents, friends, siblings, classmates, K-12 educators, and neighbors. So I will speed it up somewhat for the last 10, 15 minutes or so. At the root of this whole project lies the very first assignment that I was given when I came to the museum, which was to create a collection strategy. And it's usually quite a dry document. I'm really sorry, this is the worst slide in the PowerPoint because it's really just a Google document. But it was the first thing that I was asked to do when I got to the museum. And they're important. Collection strategies are very carefully thought about. Museums have often sprung from personal collections and interests of extremely wealthy patrons. And so now, today, as we're trying to rethink and have a special emphasis on collecting mandates to ensure that acquisitions reflect the expressions of a whole people, we're now very careful and intentional. And I think always have been, but there's an emphasis on really thinking carefully about what these roadmaps are going to tell us. It is a roadmap. It's something that says, here's what we have in the collection, here's where we want to go over the next 3 to 5 years. And so to effectively write such a document requires quite an intimate understanding of what lies in a collection already. And that was difficult for me because I was new to the museum in 2019 when I was asked to do this. And my curatorial training had also come from the architecture and design department at MoMA. And there, the term craft had been absolutely shunned since the dawn of the department in 1932. And I'm going to quote Philip Johnson here, who is one of the originating curators in that particular department. He wrote decisively in that decade of the 1930s that, quote, "The craft spirit does not fit an age geared to the machine technique." And so it was absolutely not part of my curatorial training when I came here, and very similarly neglected over the course of 4 art history degrees. No university course had ever brought me in contact with the term studio craft. I'd never heard of long-standing schools like Haystack, Pilchuck, or Penland. I'd never touched a Gullah Geechee basket before I came here, or heard of the Sheridan style of leather making. And yet I was hired, and I do often wonder, and I did often wonder in those early years, why? And it's a question for the person who hired me. I was hired to steward a collection of contemporary craft that had also not only just craft as its emphasis, but a North American emphasis. And as you can tell from my accent, I don't come from here. So if there was something less confident that I felt about than craft, it was American history. And so I, over the course of the first year that I was here, which thank goodness actually included some of the pandemic when I was at home, I ordered and read every book that I could find that was relevant to post-war craft in the United States, a good few of which had been published by my predecessors at the MFA. And then I had a collection strategy ready, and I handed it in very proudly in late February 2020, which was a terrible time to hand in any document that you hoped would have some serious reflection, because of course then the pandemic happened. And so without access to the museum, collection objects, paper files, all of these things, that was the moment in time that I decided that I would go back and ask people who had made the exhibitions and made the acquisitions before me about their choices. Their choices really mattered, that I knew them, so that I understood where I was going to take this particular roadmap. And so from the limits of reading and learning at home, I was gradually opened up by my predecessors, who were deeply generous with their time and reflections. I spoke to Jonathan Fairbanks, who essentially founded the Contemporary Craft Collection when he was chair of what is today the Arts of the Americas department, although then it was split into painting and sculpture and decorative arts. I spoke to some of his protégés, Ned Cook, Jerry Ward, Janine Foligno, my current amazing colleague, Noni Gadsden, my immediate predecessor, the very accomplished Emily Zilber. In all, I spoke to 12 former MFA colleagues who'd made collecting decisions for the MFA's Contemporary Craft program, and a recurring theme emerged from those conversations, which was education. And you may have noticed, and it will be a continuing theme towards the end of my slides too, it's hard to find always pictures of objects, because these conversations and the research I have done galvanized by these conversations are, as I was saying to Rachel earlier, they are about people, place, and pedagogy. They are not always about the erratic object, which is so often what we focus on at the museum. So the folks I spoke to talked about their own educational experiences, the canons and approaches that they had metabolized when they learned and then carried forward. They talked about the places that they had learned here when they were at the MFA and either teaching or taking, as Ned did, classes. And so through all of those conversations, I said the topic really was about access to knowledge. And I felt that while the conversations were really generative and foundational, they also catalyzed in me a desire to find people and places that would offer a wider cross-pollination than I could find in the institutional history. And so that's when I decided to think about traveling and moving outside of the museum rather than just staying within it. And it was around this time, and we are really lucky to have one of these authors in the audience today, Rachel, that I returned to the catalogs for 2 exhibitions on aspects of craft education that had made a really large impact on me. I wouldn't have done this project had it not been for these 2 scholars. So Rachel and her colleague Diana Greenwald's genre-defying show on Haystack Mountain School of Craft, you might have seen it at the Portland Museum of Art, in Maine in 2019. And then Elizabeth Essner's really robust reflection on 50 years of Peters Valley School of Craft in 2020. But aside from these 2 really kind of, as I said, genre-defining and standout projects, a handful of established craft schools that have published their own histories and very well-documented sort of unicorn sites like Black Mountain College, the topic of education and its impact on craft history in the United States hasn't really gotten all of the attention that I think it deserves. And so as I found out from conversations with my predecessors, educational environments and pedagogies, like other ephemeral modes of living and knowing, are very worthwhile considering for what they can tell us about how culture is produced and instrumentalized by individuals and communities. And actually another book that was very significant for this part of the research was Howard Singerman, who's a professor at my university, the City University of New York, art subjects. And so I thought about, he looks at the history of art schools of this period in time in a really wonderfully critical way. So my question, after speaking with them, after looking at the field in these two important publications that had been recently published, was could craft education become a lens through which to consider the broad and really cacophonous participation that characterizes contemporary craft, and help me open up what craft might mean here in the museum where I worked. So craft is taught everywhere, every day, and in a million different ways in the United States, as we know. And yet the academic discipline of craft history, which is still a very nascent field, and the Art Museum, which is historically a fairly conservative and insular institution, tells quite a narrow story of craft education that begins with design reform in settlement schools, flourishes after World War II with a network of organizations organized by wealthy patrons, like, as you see here, the philanthropist and craft artist Aileen Osborne Webb. The outcome of these different pieces of infrastructure of the post-war craft landscape is many impressive generations of craft artists that are known under a movement term, studio craft, for the one-of-the-kind works they produced in their ateliers, and which in many ways dominates the MFA's kind of core contemporary craft collection. But their work, as I came to learn more about contemporary craft history, really by no means tells the whole story. Peripheralized or wholly ignored are vast swaths of professionalized educational spaces that produced significant craft artists, especially indigenous makers at seminal sites like the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, for example, in New Mexico, or trade-oriented programs where graduate skills and output could not be easily packaged for museums and collectors. And I visited both of these spaces amongst many others that really had not been integrated into this larger history of craft, at least as I found it here at the museum. And so I'm not going to go over my 50 minutes. I'm going to speak a little bit more extemporaneously about the following slides that you will see. Many of the craft histories that I read focused on Rochester Institute of Technology and the School of American Craftsmen that was founded by Aileen Osborne Webb alongside her founding of the Museum of Contemporary Craft, now MAD, Craft Horizons, part of the American Craft Council, ACC, lots of these really important, fundamental, kind of foundational organizations for supporting and proliferating and disseminating contemporary craft in the United States. But I really wanted to look more broadly than that. I wanted to think about the ways in which a former project of mine, Designing Motherhood, had looked at midwifery as craft. And so I went to go visit the Common Sense Childbirth Center in Florida and looked at Black histories of midwifery in the US and the ways in which Black midwives codified what they did in their own words as a form of craft. I wanted to look through leather, actually, as a particular medium and material. I've met so many amazing saddle makers. We also live in a shoe city, in a place where Sarah Gurin, for example, practices in an old 10-footer in Wakefield, Massachusetts. And these are not really histories that have been part of the studio craft history past, but even sort of wider conversations in contemporary craft. This is one of my favorite visits. I went to go visit Rick and Connie Whittier, who are two retired police officers. Rick had 2 heart attacks and decided that the force was not for him anymore. And so he retired but needed some kind of income. And so he looked back to his growing up and going ice fishing and spear fishing. And he has this phenomenal decoy business that he took me down into his basement. And part of doing this trip over the US was just trusting people that when they said, come to my basement, I've got something interesting to show you, it was legitimate. And they did actually have something interesting to show me and weren't trying to, I don't know, do something else. But he had these wonderful, wonderful decoys. And he and Connie had sort of almost a factory line production in some senses, setting them up, hanging them from the ceiling. But then it was kind of great. We had the Basquiat show up at the time. He too had this whole shelf of different spray paints, and he chopped off the end of a snow cone cup and other things to make his tools to then really beautifully, masterfully spray paint while they were hanging in the air. He wouldn't even touch these fish. It would just arc the spray paint around, the can would arc around. And he would look at some of the books from his childhood to think about color and shape and form. And then also, Sloyd is an important part, this sort of system of handicraft that started in Finland and then came really through the folk school system here into the United States. We do have a serious commitment here to folk and self-taught art, and there is a connection, certainly, between my amazing colleague Michael Bramwell in Arts of the Americas and what I do in contemporary craft. But in the studio craft conversations, at least as they were, again, as I found them here in the museum, this part of craft history wasn't mentioned often at all. And I think it was often because of, amongst other things, the anxiety of being labeled an amateur, the anxiety of being labeled outside of what programs like PIA were trying to create. Another very important, and I will actually read the paragraph on this because it's a critical part of it. Another important aspect of the studio craft dominant history of craft education is that it had a problem, to put it mildly, with racial and gender equity. The reasons for this are complex, but have roots in pervasive cultural misogyny and the fact that this particular strand of craft education was significantly built on access facilitated through the GI Bill. Like federally backed mortgages of the time, these benefits went disproportionately to white men. So adopting a position common to craft history until very recently, a 2007 article for American Craft magazine suggests that the GI Bill was, quote, a happy instance in which, quote, the spoils of war became a powerful instrument for expanding democracy, opportunity, and creative expression, end quote. However, as Kathleen J. Friedel notes in her landmark 2009 study of the GI Bill, which craft historian Jenny Sorkin, amongst others, has very smartly applied to the specifics of the craft field, to qualify for such benefits, a soldier had to be honorably discharged, and this discriminated against all types of people, including those who were censored for homosexuality or protested race segregation, as well as women Air Force service pilots or WASPs who could be rejected on the technicality that they worked under the aegis of the civil service. Moreover, and this is important, I think, Friedel describes the gap between the intention and the impact of this transformative legislation as one that depended on local and state administrators who operated, and I quote her, with implicit notions of deservedness and reliance on gender and race codes underwriting citizenship, end quote, and also the right to a professional life, the latter still hard even now for many women identifying people to claim. So, in the book, I look at the ways in which this actually metabolized this sort of real contrary part of the craft field in the 1960s and 70s, called a craft renaissance, meant to be sort of inherently open and accessible to everybody, and yet in many ways and narrowing in some senses through these places that were, or through these pieces of legislation that were meant to give them access. And that is reflected to a certain extent in some of the sort of landmark moments of contemporary craft at this particular point. I talk in more depth in the book and in the longer form of this lecture about Objects USA, and I'm happy to come back to these images. A phenomenally important exhibition in 1969. I think myself and pretty much every other craft historian has this catalogue and the update from 2020 on their library desk. And very important also for doing what PIA did, they had sort of detailed biographies of each of the 300 and change individual makers in the exhibition, celebrating them as individual and accomplished artists. But there were massive racial and gender disparities in this particular presentation. There were, I think, under 5 African-American artists. There were no women in the wood section. It was divided by material. And so I was really struck by this as I was looking through some of these very important seminal moments in time that defined in many ways the decade or decade and a half when PIA came into existence. And I was really struck by this, and I'll quote Jenny Sorkin here. She has really excellent scholarship on early generations of artists in residence within studio craft dominant seasonal craft schools like Haystack, Pilchuck, and Penland in the late 20th century. And she writes, quote, that they were often heavily influenced by Native American woven forms or exhibited, quote, ethnic and traditional textiles to, quote, explore and expand a repertoire of possibilities in, for example, textile practice, and produced work across media in which, quote, cultural references make themselves apparent. And yet, people from the communities that inspired such work were rarely welcomed in representative numbers as participants in these craft schools. Simultaneously, the teaching legacies of Indigenous, Black, and Brown makers in schools and sites where their ideas have long flourished, like Howard University, this historically Black college and university where Bisa Butler gained her foundations, or within Indigenous family networks, as traced by many of the Indigenous makers that I met, have only recently begun to receive wider recognition and support from national craft organizations. So this is what took me across the United States to places like the Chicago School of Shoemaking, Sonia Flenda McNair's garden in urban Toledo, Ohio, to Margaret Bruning's Sheep to Shore project in Poe Run, West Virginia, and to many other places in between. This is the map of the route that I took. It went across, as I said, all 48 states. But I will conclude just here with these final two slides. I think I have about 3 minutes of time before we hit 3 p.m. So I'll conclude here with a poem that I was lucky enough to hear from Jonathan Fairbanks, the very first person to really have a craft curatorship here at the MFA. It was halfway through one of the phone conversations that I had with him back in 2021. And he was sort of talking with, as most people do when they talk about Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, this deep reverence for his time spent there. And he recited an unpublished poem. And I was on the phone, so I don't know if he had it somewhere stuck by his desk or if he just knew it. But it was by the late, great ceramicist, poet, and educational philosopher M.C. Richards, with whom he'd taken a Haystack course in the 1970s. And I wish I had taken this course, called Writing as Handicraft. She'd sent it to his wife Louisa on scraps of paper, and you see it just here. The stanzas were really beautiful, but it was his own coda to this poetic homily that landed most deeply with me. And he said, her spaces within the poems are as important as the text, as signals of the way to recite them. You have to pause for those spaces between the words, end quote. Richard's intentionally spacious punctuation offers equal weight to that which is unspoken as that which is uttered, and the time in which to explore both is an integral part of meaning making. It felt like a metaphor for the research journey I subsequently found myself on. The interrelationship of presence and absence was useful too for someone who thought they were learning craft history from the ground up at the start of this project, and then came to realize that I, like most people, including all of you, I think, knew craft all along, but just in my case, in the glassmakers and knitters and carpenters who populated my Scottish childhood town. I knew contemporary craft, and so do most people, just often in a dialect that is different from museums. Echoing MC Richards, one of my favorite historians, Sarah Knott, writes about similar moments of interstitial silence in the historical record and the depths that that quietude contains. I've returned to her work time and time again, and I really, it's not an exaggeration, over many years, while thinking about the ways in which contemporary craft fits and doesn't fit often into a fine arts museum, and the ways in which varied craft practices find a home in the often narrow lines that such institutions draw for it. She points to anecdotes, to searching for, gathering, and stitching together individual stories, just like this craft school's project, as a compelling historical methodology in an epilogue to her excellent 2019 book, Mother is a Verb. Noting that this kind of method emerges as a mode of inquiry in the early 17th century when anecdote was, quote, and I quote her, a means of exploring private lives and inner worlds, in contrast to the conventional preoccupations of the doings of important men, end quote. Knott highlights that such an approach allows us to unearth fragmented histories that have not been privileged, small shards and occasional nuggets, she calls them, left in the records that have until now been passed over. In doing so, we honor histories, as she says, interrupted by care work. And in her case, she's talking about the work of mothering and tending to young children. But in the context of this book on craft, I talk about it as the significant tending involved in the labor of teaching. And what I love about anecdotes, too, is that there is no pretense to comprehensiveness or claim to any encyclopedic endeavor. Instead, anecdotes are humane in their relationality, willfully idiosyncratic and resistant to taxonomy, and they demand our attentiveness and close looking. And so I'll close by saying, when we ask almost anyone, amateur or professional, about how they know how to do something with their hands, then we can watch, when we ask them that question, their face light up. The stories they tell narrate a craft history more expansive than those found in many of the craft history books that have defined the forms of craft that have made it into museums like mine. These are the stories that I wanted to read when I began my job at the MFA a few years ago, and I couldn't find them, although I know they existed before I went to find them too. And so I went in search of them on my doorstep at PIA and much further afield. And I gathered them and made a book from them so that the next time that any of us are writing a collection strategy or any other narrative part of this field, we have it. So gratitude forever, I always say to the storytellers themselves. Thank you. Very happy to take any questions if you would like to ask them, or if you prefer just to have conversation afterwards, we can also do that in less of a group setting. But yeah, please go ahead.
I have a mic for you here.
Microphone. Oh, Paige has a mic.
All right. Do you have any idea how the tuition of PIA compared to other divisions of the College of Arts at BU at that time?
It's a really good question. No, but I have actually been in touch with somebody from the archives, and that would be a wonderful thing to ask them. It went from being waived for really interesting folks that were coming in to around $2,500–3,000 at the beginning of the program, and it shot up over 10 years to $11,000, which is a huge and steep increase over time. And so, no, I don't, but it's a good question, and I would love to know a bit of a comparison. I think from the very beginning, it was and this is a sort of a running theme I found when I went to different craft programs, both institutionalized in universities, long-running, other places. Craft programs are really fragile a lot of the time. They often not started with generous endowments. They don't have a big ballast behind them. And the ones that have survived have often been the ones that I noted Aileen Osborne-Webb and others like her began in that immediate post-war period. But it was, I think from the very beginning, looking at the records in the archives of American art, amongst other places, and the correspondence between Silber, Helmuth, Rossbach, another faculty member, and then some of the faculty and students, particularly unstable and unsustainable, financially at least, from the very beginning. Yeah. But it was a supernova in a sense, in that it had this absolute... when I spoke to faculty and students, not one of them said... All of them said, let me make this a positive rather than a negative sentence. All of them said, that was the time of my life. It was unbelievable. It was the most special place I've ever been a part of. And it indelibly changed me and made me the person and the artist that I am today. And so I think there was sort of a running on fumes kind of atmosphere to it, where even as the financial element of it petered out, there was a really real ethos to it, which was also supported, I would say, by, at the turn of the 70s into the 80s, for a good decade and a half, by a market for some of the folks who were coming out wanting to be these sort of individual celebrated artists. And not everybody wanted to be that. But yeah. Sorry, that was a roundabout way of answering your question. Thank you for asking. If you have information on it, please let me know.
Can I just, a really quick follow-up? Do you know if there was a relationship at all between PIA and the Bennett School in Boston?
Though I don't think that there was a formal one, but I think, again, with the Eliot School, North Bennett Street School, PIA being part of that, the Cambridge Cooperative Workshop for people like Judy Kensley McKee, RISD, not that much further around the corner as well. There was a good body. I mean, New England's an amazing place for craft, so I don't know that there were... As far as I have found, there were not formalized links between these places, but there was a ton of overlap, especially because often folks who were coming out of these programs needed to share tools. They needed to share studio environments. They didn't have the university or the place that they had learned open to them indefinitely. And so they came together a lot of the time to be able to share those spaces, and came from the different programs in the city. But yeah, thank you. Any other questions that folks have? Martina, yeah.
It was fantastic. As you mentioned that they pulled together the course with the most stellar instructors that they could find. How did they lure them to Boston? And why Boston? Why would they want to come here?
So it's a really, really good question. I think they did have a pot of money from Franklin at the beginning. And I think it was a case of saying, well, this person's coming. Do you want to come? I mean, for wood, for example, Krenov was revered at that point in time. He was such an important figure within woodworking. He was, depending on who you were, he was also somewhat terrifying. He had a very strong personality, but, a beautiful writer as well. And in the 1970s was publishing and really sort of gaining attention. And so once you had some of these key anchor folks, other people wanted to be part of this. I also think it was a particularly special point for craft education at that moment in time. There was this efflorescence, as I described partially. It was a shorter talk, and others have written on beautifully. There was an efflorescence post-1945 of different craft programs. But the 1970s was a really interesting time for people who wanted to experiment and try out and test in different ways. And I think this offered them a sense of being invited almost to teach in an art school-like environment, which for them, I mean, many of the people coming, they wanted to be recognized within the fine arts world or within the capital A arts world for what they were doing. Or even if they didn't, there was a really conflicted relationship. There's so much scholarship of the 70s, 80s, even 90s, even today. What's fine art? What's craft? Which is a lot of spilled ink in a way, worrying about things that don't need to be worried about because it was just good work. But I think it was offering people an environment where they could stake a claim to their status as a particular kind of practicing artist. Most of the teachers who came had their studios right adjacent to or within the workshop itself, and they were not necessarily called upon to like create a beautiful syllabus and then teach it really faithfully. In fact, most of them couldn't. It was mostly like, look at me, I'm amazing, and here's your model, you're welcome, and I might come around to your bench if you don't annoy me at some point during the week, but if not, I have a teaching assistant for that. And so, and I joke because there was some, I remember Missy Stevens, a student in the fiber arts department, saying that the teachers that she had there were incredible mentors, but it was more as if like you wanted to aspire to be them as an artist rather than people who were coming because they're like, yes, I want a teaching career. They wanted to be recognized, and this was a place that was going to recognize them, and they were going to feed into that larger idea of recognition for their craft and their practice at a national level. Yeah. And I will say, we also have, Rachel, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're the amazing author of Haystack. So if people have questions about that phenomenal project, Rachel is here.
Hi, I'm Barbara Martin, and I was in the education department here for many years. And before I say anything, I want to ask, how many people here remember New American Furniture? Because I have a feeling maybe...
That's great. That's
so
great.
I don't need to describe it. But that this was the show Ned Cook did here. I just want, it's interesting to me to hear that at the approval level there was skepticism, because by 3 years later, when it reached the gallery, I just remember it as one of the most fun exhibitions that I ever worked on.
Yeah.
I do remember that when Ned's label texts first arrived, they seemed very academic, which may have had to do with all these, of making sure that this was, et cetera. And the wonderful thing about Ned was that, the many wonderful things about Ned, but one of them was he got things to you in time, even before the deadline. He was renowned through
He has not changed. He's very timely responding to emails.
And when you would say to him, "Oh, this is so great," etc., he would say, "I believe in giving people time to do their best work." And so what I remember is also being able to say to him, I think for people in the galleries who don't, this is kind of heavy and abstract, and this, and all of that furniture was here because, the 25 pieces that had been made, each in response to a piece in the collection. And so one of the things I remember was just how exciting and revitalizing it was for the American Decorative Arts collection at that moment, that people had gone and chosen a high chest or a table and were responding to it and reacting to it. But it was all here, stored in a gallery. And we went up there, day after, and sat on the floor with the label and looked at it. And he was saying, well, this is what's important. I say, okay, what's here doesn't say that. How do we say that? And it was one of the most fun experiences I ever had with labels. So it's
Such
a great
recollection.
memory,
I love it.
That whole sort of phenomenon. And we also, it was so long ago, we had a paper map that would take you into the galleries to show you where those inspirational pieces were. So that was a real transformative moment for me with that collection. And I also do remember hiring some of the teachers in the BU program to give this kind of talk at the
That's
Museum of Fine Arts.
That's awesome.
I think what I realized now was because I was here in the early 80s, it was its very last year, that I thought, oh, what a wonderful program, and so established it, and then poof. But they were lovely people. So,
thank you. Those are amazing recollections. And it's reminded me actually, Barbara, that I did note it on a slide, but I didn't call it out as I meant to. One of Ned's colleagues, Jerry Ward, along with Jonathan Fairbanks, did a lovely jewel box of an exhibition on PIA at the Fullercraft Museum in 2003. There's a great catalogue which you can still find on eBay, if not other places. I have a copy if somebody's interested. I can always scan it. But it brought together many of the graduates. And it was one of my other sort of first introductions to this particular area of research. Thank you all for coming. If you have other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, but I appreciate you spending time.